Welcome, everyone. Welcome back to the show. We have a very special episode now. Beethoven, always one of the greats, and we have a real expert here to talk about Beethoven. This is Professor Thomas W. Posen. He is a visiting assistant professor of music at the College of Idaho, and he holds a PhD in music theory from the School of Music at McGill University. We like that place. That's got all the great professors. William Kaplan, Peter Schubert, all the kings, all the legends. And now we're really honored to have you, Professor Posen. Welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks. I'm very happy to be here. And I've watched some of these interviews with Peter and Bill, and of course I got to study with them, and so I'm very grateful to be here.
I'm very honored to have you here. And, you know, you have a great new article that's come out, and I want to talk about that. So maybe we should just jump right into that. I spoke about Beethoven, windows into Beethoven's lessons in Bonn. Okay, so I think a lot of people know his studies with Albrechtsberger and Haydn, but your article is a little bit different. Can you speak about that?
Yeah, so ultimately, what I realized is that Beethoven's study with Albrechtsberger, Haydn, and later Salieri were quite a bit later in his life. And so he must have therefore learned sort of the fundamentals of composition much earlier. And in fact, when I started to look into it, I came to the conclusion ultimately that he was composing and improvising at a very high level, probably around the age of 13. So really, my article... It's an article that I wanted to read foundationally. It's something that I wanted to read, and then I didn't quite find this article, so I ended up having to write it. It started with Gustav Nottebohm ultimately, and I think the kind of the currents of the times helped me see some of the threads through it. So Professor Robert Yerdigan's work on child composers was really influential, and then there's been some recent work looking at Bonn and looking at the libraries in Bonn and kind of determining how important Bonn actually was in Germany. So there's sort of a reconception of Bonn. I think Bonn was interpreted to be sort of a small town with not a whole lot going on, and so therefore Beethoven went to Vienna. But actually, when we look at it, Bonn was a very rich musical place that really offered a fertile place for Beethoven to develop his talent. So the article basically looks to understand how Beethoven was taught composition, improvisation, and piano technique, I might say. And also it looks at kind of how he might have also been taught theory. And so maybe at some point during this episode, we'll talk about the relationship, as I see it, between theory and composition and practice and partimento and all these other things. So
awesome. Yeah,
that was the goal.
That's great. So and also, just before we go deeper, I looked at your CV, and you've actually done some research on the Eroica Symphony, and this is a composer you've looked at before.
Yes, I'm absolutely obsessed with Beethoven.
It's good to know.
I think, it all started. I remember I was at the New Mexico State University, and I was wandering the music halls one night. And I heard a pianist practicing, and I went in there and said, "What are you playing? This is amazing." And he said, "Oh, this is a Beethoven sonata." And at the time, I was pretty naive, and I didn't know a lot about Beethoven beyond the Fifth Symphony and the Ninth Symphony, and kind of his Fur-Elise and big works that are publicly known. And then he played this sonata, and I thought, "Wow, that sonata is really good." And then I went to go listen to another sonata, and I thought, "Oh my God, I like this one too." And then I realized that basically everything I listened to by Beethoven was phenomenal. So I became obsessed, and I started playing a lot of Beethoven sonatas, and I would give Beethoven concerts almost exclusively of sonatas. I gave a concert with 3 Beethoven sonatas, which was maybe a little excessive, but I enjoyed it. And then I became interested in learning about how he composed. And so
what was it about the sonata? What was it about the sonatas that really captured you?
Yeah, well, I think it's a more general thing about Beethoven that captures me. And I think that Beethoven is both accessible to the Liebhaber, so the kind of just person who loves music, and also to the Kenner, so the people who are in the know of music and study music in detail. And so I think Beethoven, you get a lot out of just listening to Beethoven and enjoying it. Everybody can do that. And then when you look at the scores and you look at the relationship between the notes and the structure, it rewards even more. So he's a great composer, both for the amateur, if you will, and also for the intense theorist that scrutinizes every note.
Mm. Right, right. Okay, so let's keep going on then. So I interrupted you there. Sorry.
Oh no. Well, we're speaking about, so yeah. So I studied his compositional process for the Eroica by looking at the sketches for the Eroica, and the Eroica is an especially good piece for this because we have a very relatively complete sketchbook of the Eroica sketches. And so my goal was to understand better how he composed. And so I studied the sketches and basically reconstructed them in a sense, because the sketches are effectively just single lines. They're sort of a shorthand, a musical shorthand. So I realized the harmonies and added some kind of some voices and texture, and then played them at the piano so you could hear them. And then I analyzed them with a theory of formal functions, Bill Kaplan's work. And then essentially I compared sketches across his process to answer the question, what was he trying to do and why? So I really wanted to understand his compositional process. Now, I was very fortunate to study with Bill, and Bill was extremely wise to have me cut a large portion of my dissertation. My dissertation was already massive; it was something like 500 plus pages, and it could have been even bigger. But Bill was very wise and had me cut a large portion of it, and one of that parts was this article. Effectively, it was at least the seeds to this article. And so originally I was writing an article about like, oh, here's how Beethoven was taught composition. Here's how he thinks, and not the full picture, or at least here's a part of how he thinks that I think is important for understanding how he composes. And then it was a study of the sketches. And Bill was very right to have me trim it down to just be sketches. But this article was kind of sitting in the foyer, and I went back to it, and it came about quite quickly because it had already been sort of written for that period of time. So yeah, I'm very interested in learning and understanding how Beethoven in particular composed. And of course, there's a lot of overlap with other composers, Mozart, Haydn, the Italian school, Partimento, thorough bass, solfeggio. So it's all interrelated in various ways.
Yeah. So can I ask you where that the crossroad for that is? So essentially, um, I think things have changed a little bit with schema theory and Partimento and this general renewed interest in general bass in general. So how does that mix with Schenker and Riemann and like as a theorist now? So how do we look at Beethoven differently than we did maybe 20 years ago?
Yeah, it's a good question. I suppose this question is a little bit about the relationship of practice and theory, and what music theory is foundationally. And well, let me talk first about Partimento, Generalbass, thorough bass, and so forth. And Felix Stiergarten has a really interesting thought on this, and he talks about he says for a long time there was this German word called Rauche, which was he calls it in the shadows of German cuisine, and Rauche was renamed to rucola, and rucola is arugula, so it's the green thing that you'll find on pizzas a lot in Austria. And apparently it became very popular once it was rebranded under the name rucola. And Felix Stiergarten suggests that the word, I'll read a quote from him. He says, certainly compared to the disarming Mediterranean nonchalance of Partimento, the words Generalbass or thorough bass can sound dusty, pompous, or clumsy. But for me, thorough bass reveals the full but largely untapped potential of Partimenti. So, and then he claims a renaissance of thorough bass as the true foundation of 18th century performance, improvisation, composition, and analysis would be an even more significant event than the discovery of schemata. So I think really thorough bass, general bass, parlamento are interconnected. And the way that I'm currently seeing it is that Europe is very interconnected. And so when we speak of an Italian theory versus a German theory versus a Swiss theory or French theory or so forth, I think by Beethoven's time, everybody was traveling kind of everywhere, and ideas were crossing and mixing. And so I've found it a little bit challenging to separate the nation, I guess, from the theory, or the theory from the nation.
It becomes a sort of musical theory lingua franca across the continent.
I think that's a good way of thinking about it. Now, my interest, I suppose, is again understanding, as to the best of my abilities, how Beethoven thought and how he composed. Now, that means that I need to go into historical pedagogy and kind of look at his training, look how he might have understood things theoretically, and so forth. And so then that raises the question, well, what do we do with more modern theories like Neo-Romanian theory, functions theory, Roman numeral analysis, and so forth? And this is a complex question. And I think music theory is in some sense a meta language that helps us. It uses words that help us describe musical phenomena that are understood in a musical way. But we've developed words to kind of label things and make us understand them with this meta language. And then, so I think fundamentally music theory, good music theory, is about developing a very precise, concise meta language.
Right. So one thing that's interesting about Beethoven is he is kind of straddling that period where you're starting to and we're going to talk about the article in depth. So functions, so we talk about a little bit of that, and the idea of things that are not straight partimento. It's not exactly the kind of things that we'll see, and I'm very interested in that. We need to know the history, and so maybe shall we talk about the two? Which theorists do you think we should start first? Then should we talk about Kirnberger or Vogler?
I think let's start with Kirnberger, because that's the
Okay.
article precedes. Well, so yeah, basically for listeners, the article starts by saying, kind of what it's going to talk about, and then I look into the studies in Vienna about what he learned after he left Bonn, and then I go back into Bonn and I start with Kirnberger's, actually his smaller treatise. And I think Beethoven probably studied Kirnberger's larger book as well, but there seems to be pretty clear evidence that he encountered his Grundsätze.
Okay.
Die wahren Grundsätze zum Gebrauch der Harmonie.
Yeah, so let's talk about this. Quite an influential music theorist and purported personal student of Bach, at least according to his claim. So yeah, what was the influence on Beethoven?
Yeah, so Gustav Nottebohm, a very important Beethoven scholar, found on one of Beethoven's manuscripts a little notation in the top left-hand corner. This is example 4, which has been published for the first time. It was in the Vienna Gesellschaft der Musikfreunde in Vienna. So example 4 in the article. And on the top left-hand corner, Beethoven writes out a series of 3 chords, and or triads, and then to the right, 7th chords. And then he writes kind of very specifically about what these chords are and the foundational chords. And the language here exactly matches Kirnberger's Grundsätze. And so I was looking at other treatises, and you see some of these chords in other treatises like Petrie's Anleitung, which Nottebohm also said this could have been a good source for Beethoven to study. But the language differs in that, and also the presentation differs slightly. So I work out these connections and show them in great detail between examples 4, 5, and 6. And so and it has to do with the nature that Kirnberger uses to write about these. And interestingly, the chords are in a Noten Beyspiel, so they're at the end of the treatise, and the text is in the text proper. So Beethoven would have effectively had to combine the end of the treatise with the beginning. So he wrote out the notation. So this is a pretty foundational concept to understand that there's only triads and their inversions, and then a seventh chord, various types, plus their inversions. And I think that this is something that Beethoven would have encountered quite early in his training. So this page is dated, I think, to 1790, but I think Beethoven encountered it very early. And if you look at the page here, you can see that the top left-hand corner has a darker ink than the rest of the page, the Klage. And so I think that this was going to be kind of his theory page. He learned these chords, then probably did lots of keyboard work, forgot about it, and then came back to it and wrote this lead. That's my interpretation of this.
Can I just ask a quick question? Was he self-taught, or did he have a teacher? I know his father was tough on him.
Yeah.
He had tough, his dad was really tough. But did he have a teacher that instructed him with this book, or did he just read it himself?
I think so. Yeah. So in example one, I kind of sketch an outline of Beethoven's teachers. And so Beethoven's father is known to have been hard on him, but I think also he was probably an excellent musician and probably taught Beethoven the rudiments of piano at a very early age. And it's clear that his father wanted his son to progress Beethoven that we know, because he sought out lessons for him with very important musicians. And so Tobias Pfeiffer, Willibald Koch was an organist, Gilles van der Eden, he was in the Bonn court. And we don't know for sure if Andrea Lucchesi taught him, but he was there. And so really senior Beethoven, Ludwig van Beethoven's father, was involved in the music scene quite well. And then Beethoven's grandfather was once the Kapellmeister of Bonn. So they were extremely well connected in the Bonn world. And so
grandfather is the Kapellmeister. That's pretty well connected in music.
Absolutely. And I think we see this whenever when like Mozart, for example, Leopold was one of the best musicians in Europe. And so it's perhaps a little surprised that baby Mozart, Amadeus, would rise to such an extent, right? When you have a father and family that's so well connected in the music scene. And I think the exact same thing holds for Beethoven. So it's not clear to me exactly where or who introduced Beethoven to Kirnberger. I think there's potential that Christian Gottlob Neefe showed Beethoven some Kirnberger, and one of the evidence that I used to make this connection is that Neefe claims that he worked with Beethoven on Bach's Well-Tempered Clavier. And if that happened, which I think it probably did, and we do know that Beethoven studied the Well-Tempered Clavier in great detail, and Kirnberger's treatise, the one I talk about, would have been very interesting in this regard because it actually includes two analyses of a prelude and fugue, or is it two fugues? Anyway, it includes very sophisticated analyses of these. And so if Gottlob Neefe was trying to say, hey, here's how you should understand these preludes and fugues, I think Kirnberger's treatise would have been absolutely ideal. And I should mention that this treatise is actually not written by Kirnberger, but it's effectively his ideas. It's ghostwritten by Schütz.
Right. And is that because now I read this that Kirnberger, I don't know if I'm mixing up the person, but he was not perhaps didn't he get into an argument with him? This, I'm going on a tangent, but he was not as eloquent, or rather schooled in writing. So he had people, so he dictated to people essentially.
That's interesting. Yeah, I don't know as much about Kirnberger in terms of like that side of things, but that could be, it could be. And definitely he had a ghost written by Johann Abram Peter Schultz. And
it's very interesting.
Yeah, Beach, who did a translation of this treatise, remarks that Schultz spent some time looking through Rameau and may have synthesized more thoughts from Rameau with Kirnberger, and Kirnberger more or less signed off on this. And so, it's so interrelated and connected.
Wow, that's pretty. Yeah, that's very interesting. Someone should look into that. But okay, so so you showed the example 4. Then that's so it's very clear that there's a connection there.
Yeah.
So moving on from that, you want to talk a little bit about fundamental bass theory now
Yeah,
with
absolutely.
from that
So,
treatise? Yeah.
yeah, for those who are interested and want to follow along in the article, I love that this article is open access, by the way, on Music Theory Online. It makes it
Yeah.
so much easier to share and look over. So yeah, the fundamental bass is an idea from Rameau, and it's essentially the idea that an inversion of a chord still has the same fundamental bass. So if we take a triad and invert it twice, we can still say that the fundamental bass exists. And Kirnberger calls it the Grundbass. So in example 8, you can see he shows the different chords and then how the bass note changes, the basso continuo, but the Grundbass or the fundamental bass stays the same. Now, I think this is a really important concept because it affords, as I see it, the concept of harmonic prolongation. And I initially, for quite a while, I got on the kind of anti-Roman numeral train, if you want to call it that. And I think that the pushback against Roman numerals was a very appropriate reaction. I think for a while we went really deep into Roman numeral analysis and kind of, in some sense, lost the plot a little bit. But then I think that a complete excision of Roman numerals was maybe
throwing the baby out with the
too
bathwater.
far.
Okay.
Yeah, and so I think maybe we can kind of bring it back a little bit. Now, I don't think Beethoven actually would have explained much in terms of Roman numerals. And when we look at Mozart, we don't see many Roman numerals, but we do see the fundamental bass. And all that a Roman numeral does is assign the scale degree, it very explicitly, to the fundamental bass. And so it's not far to go from fundamental bass to Roman numeral theory. It's very, very close. And so if a composer understands deeply the fundamental bass, as I think Beethoven did, and Mozart and all these guys, I think you're also thinking in the sense that we use Roman numerals to model that thought about the movement of the fundamental bass.
So this is Kirnberger, and this is from that treatise, or is this
Correct.
mentioned by Nottebohm? Okay, I see. As mentioned by Nottebohm. Okay, so
yeah. So Nottebohm connected this treatise to this manuscript, and then I basically said, how accurate is this connection? I verified his claim about the chords that Beethoven wrote, and then looked into this treatise and examined it closely and said, do we see expressions of these ideas in Beethoven's works? And so as I was going through the treatise and I was looking at Beethoven's earliest piano sonatas, so that he wrote at the age of 13, his Elector sonatas, I discovered some patterns in Beethoven's sonatas in the main theme that are unusual compared to Beethoven's later works, namely a descending thirds progression and root position. But I found it very prominently in Kirnberger's treatise. And I thought, wow, that's interesting. And so I looked at the first sonata and I saw that connection. And I looked at the second sonata and saw the same pattern. And the fact that we don't see that pattern in Beethoven's later works suggests to me that Beethoven may have been kind of, maybe Nefa or someone said, hey, you should compose some themes using this descending thirds progression that you see in this Kirnberger. Like, let's see what you come up with. And maybe these were kind of a product of that.
Now, you speak of harmonic prolongation. Isn't that a Schenkerian term?
It is a Schenkerian term, but we encounter it most often when we study Schenkerian theory. So this is in section 2.9. And I talk about here, so Kirnberger does not use the word prolongation, and I don't think Beethoven would have used the word prolongation. Instead, what Kirnberger says is durchgehende Akkorde, so like through-going chords. And basically what I do here is he also calls them passing chords. And so I go into how Kirnberger introduces the idea that some chords are subordinate to other chords. And so he effectively establishes the idea that if we move from, let's say, a tonic harmony in root position into a tonic harmony in first inversion, so in Roman numerals, it'd be 1 to 1/6, or in figured bass, it'd be scale degree 1 going to scale degree 3 with a figured bass 6/3. that the intervening harmony constructed on scale degree 2, and I think we can see this in maybe example 10.
Okay.
And he builds it up here. It's really nice. He shows that in example A here, that we just have the D as a melodic passing tone in the bass. And then if we start harmonizing that, we create a passing chord. So the entire chord is subordinate to the other chords. And so this is theoretically, and quite simply, the prolongation. Like, this is an explanation for prolongation. Now, so all of the ideas are there. The specific language is not. And this led me to ultimately to Joel Lester's position. And Joel Lester, I quote him. He says, "Musicians understood what they were doing, or to put it another way, that musicians did not have to await posthumous theories and the posthumous development of analytical tools in order to understand what it was that they had been doing." And so I guess here what I'm trying to say is that when we analyze Beethoven, we say, oh, look, this is a tonic prolongation, for example, that Beethoven himself would have understood it in a similar way without maybe using the exact same meta language.
Now, I've been curious about this idea that Germans, they like this idea of a chord. Like, this is a 7th chord, a 9th chord. I know if we go through, was it Kellner? They have chords, and then the Italians is more like, you have rule of the octave, and it's not so much, they think of it as a suspension. So like the 9th is a suspension and that sort of thing. But the German's chord, this is kind of, and is that true, or am I kind of imagining it?
I think it's a bit of a simplification, because I think that there's a lot of overlap here, and we'll get to Vogler in a minute. But Vogler studied in Italy and then kind of brought a bunch of Italian ideas back, and I think that there's a really strong overlap with all these ideas, and I don't think that it's, for Beethoven at least, like Kirnberger, this treatise is only part of the equation, and so I think Beethoven learned the rule of the octave and all of the kind of parts and parcels of the Italian tradition as well. It's just that he also understood this idea of prolongation, and kind of, I can take a chord and extend its function over a period of time by putting intervening chords or intervening harmonies. And these intervening harmonies need not be chords per se, but can be derived from contrapuntal complexes. And so it's not necessarily thinking chord, 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 chord. I think it's a little more intertwined and rich and horizontal, so contrapuntal.
So you have point A, and then you have point B, and then you have the different ways of getting there through the passing chords. Okay.
Yeah, so, exactly. And yeah.
No, go ahead.
Well, so the bass is understood as effectively a melodic voice, and so it ties in with this partimento tradition where you write the bass line and then you harmonize on top of it effectively. And so Kirnberger describes the bass and introduces it just like you would an embellishing tone in species counterpoint. So it's you have a passing note between the first and the third, and that D is a passing note, and then we basically just add more passing elements to it, and those happen to be coordinated to create a harmony over that moment. But the bass becomes a bass melody, and so it's still very much tied to the thorough bass, general bass tradition.
Very interesting. You mentioned rule of the octave. You mentioned, so how would that have kind of been in the Bonn atmosphere in terms of pedagogy? Is that because is that, I know CPE Bach writes, it has the formula there. I'm not sure if CPE Bach actually uses the term, but how would have Beethoven been exposed to that harmonic sequence?
Yeah, so this leads us into the Vogler, and I think maybe at this point we can jump between Kirnberger and Vogler and kind of
we can jump around.
Maybe we go directly into the Vogler just a little bit here, and then we can backtrack to describe why I think that the Vogler is connected to Beethoven in particular. But Vogler's book that I discussed here, the Kuhrpfälzischen Tonschule, it's what Giorgio Sanguinetti would call a Zibaldoni or Robert Uerdingen, and effectively it's a book that Vogler would have written probably initially for himself. It's not quite as Zibaldone because it's very organized and it's intended for others, whereas Zibaldone was intended for the person writing it. But it is essentially a book that collects a massive amount of material in as short pages as possible. It's extremely dense. And in this book has basically everything you need to start becoming a composer. And it includes the rule of the octave. It includes diminution. It includes the solfeggio exercises, modulation exercises. I mean, it's a really remarkable treatise. Very little text in this book. He later wrote a text to accompany it, but initially it was just, this is the book that he was going to use in Mannheim. And the nice thing about this book too, that I was so amazed by, is Leopold was aware of it. So this is in 1778. So Beethoven would have been 8 years old at the time. And Leopold wrote a message to Mozart, who was then in Mannheim. Now in Mannheim in Germany, that's where Vogler had gotten a position of Vice Kapellmeister. Yes. And Mozart was frustrated by this because he wanted that position. And so we get a lot of comments from Mozart about Vogler being a charlatan and so forth. And I think historically that's damaged Vogler's reputation, and Vogler is seen as sort of this wild, crazy person. And I think more and more people are looking into Vogler and said, yeah, he had some, quirks, but he also brought a lot to the table and was a very important historical figure. Anyway, he's in Mannheim, and Mozart's father, Leopold, wrote to Amadeus and said, I hear that Vogler at Mannheim has brought out a book. This is the Kuhrpfälzische Tonschule, which the government of the Palatinate has prescribed for the use of all clavier teachers in the country, both for singing and composition. I must see this book, and I have already ordered it. There must be some sound stuff in it, for he could copy the clavier method from C. P. Bach's book, the outlines of singing method from Tosi and Agricola, and the rules of composition and harmony from Fuchs, Riepel, Marper, Mattheson, Spies, Scheibe, D'Alembert, Rameau, and a host of others, and then boil them down into a shorter system such as I have long had in mind. Thus I am anxious to see whether his ideas accord with mine. You ought to have the book, for such works are useful when giving lessons. As a teacher, one is led by experience to adopt certain good methods of dealing with this or that problem, and these good methods do not all come at once. And
don't reinvent the wheel. Oh my goodness! As a teacher, don't reinvent the wheel.
Yeah, and you can see here too that Leopold is anticipating what's going to be in Vogler's book, and I think he nailed it. Vogler, it's really combines so many of these ideas. You see the rule of the octave, but crucially in Vogler's book, in addition to the rule of the octave, you have the fundamental bass notated in small notes under the rule of the octave. So theory is coupled with practice throughout the entire book, and that's pretty phenomenal.
Right. And so, so that book, it's guaranteed that you think Beethoven would have been exposed to this book.
I don't think it's guaranteed. And this article, I think the main critique, if someone were to critique it, is that it's speculative. It's very speculative, for sure. And I think, but I'm influenced a lot by Derek Remish's work, who you've had on, who kind of reconstructs J.S. Bach's pedagogy. Yes. And so I'm creating kind of the paratext, like what are the books that Beethoven had as disposable at the time? What were likely the best ones that he would have used? Do we have any evidence that links these to Beethoven in any way? Now, the evidence for Vogler's book depends on a couple of things. Number one, Vogler likely visited Bonn. And so I had a massive footnote. I have a terrible tendency of maybe it's a good thing, but I like rich footnotes. But Franz Vogler, which is one of Beethoven's friends, said in one of his books, I do not know if he enjoyed lessons with the court organist Gilles van der Eden. This is about Beethoven. After Pfeiffer's departure from Bonn, so that connects Beethoven to Pfeiffer and Gilles van der Eden in terms of the pedagogy. And he says, but I believe it because otherwise I do not know of anyone else from whom he could have learned the technical handling of the organ. As the famous organist Abbe Vogler played in Bonn, I sat by Beethoven in his sickbed. So there's some things.
There you go.
Yeah, and so clearly Vogler was in Bonn, and then we also see a guest book entry.
How old would Beethoven have been at that time?
Yeah, I think it's not clear to me exactly, but I think probably I want to say between 8 and 10.
Okay.
And now there's another entry in a visiting book, a guest book in Bonn, and it's in 1790 in the Bonn Literary Society, and it reads, on the 14th of August, Abbe Vogler, director of the Musikalischen Academy in Stockholm, visited, and he had a competition with Haydn and Beethoven on the organ in 1785. And
wait, what?
Yeah. So,
wait, how have I not heard about this? That's epic.
Yeah, it is epic. Yeah, it would have been very cool to see Vogler, Haydn, and Beethoven battle it out on the organ. Beethoven at the time would have been 15. So the details
this is like
of
the greatest anecdote of all time.
Wow. Yeah, it's so cool. I mean, Vogler was traveling all over the place, like, and he was in Mannheim, and so when this book is governed or made to be used by all the clavier teachers in the Palatinate. I mean, that's a big region, of which Bonn, I think, was a part of it. It's kind of like on the border, but Mannheim was the center. Now, Beethoven's early compositions, his variations on a piece by Dresler, were engraved in Mannheim. So Neefe seems to have had connections in Mannheim. Vogler was working. So it just, the evidence that links Vogler to Beethoven, to me, seems very convincing. And so then the other thing that Nottebohm did is he said that Beethoven wrote these really strange preludes for piano or organ. Weird, right? That they're some of the weirdest, strangest Beethoven pieces that we have, and they just modulate through all the keys extremely fast and then come back around. And so this is an exercise piece, right? I mean, this must have been assigned as sort of a modulation exercise, and Gustav Nottebohm connects these pieces with these modulation circles in Vogler's treatise. And I basically said, like, how close are these connected? You know, like, this musical circle idea is a big idea for a long time. But even C.P.E. Bach says, you know, this circle is a really great thing for planning a piece, a fantasy or something, but don't modulate through every key. That, like, you don't need to do that. Right? He explicitly says that. Now, Vogler is the opposite. Vogler shows the circle, and we can even show one of these examples. I think it's example 70.
Okay, let me find it. Okay.
Yeah, so this you could see it. He interprets it literally. So this is the weiche Tonarten, so the minor, soft, and we modulate through keys by fifth, and he shows you the pattern, and you can sit down and practice this, and you have to turn the circle as you do it, and so it's extremely literal about taking this circle of fifths and creating a modulation pattern that you can do with it. So this prelude here, this is the Opus 39, the second prelude. And if you look at the modulation patterns, they're almost all the exact same. So we have a descending movement that goes 1, 7, 6, and then 2 in the old key. And in the new key, the 6 becomes a 2 and the 2 becomes a 5. And so it's a scale mutation. Effectively, that's probably how Beethoven would have understood this modulation, and every single one of them is almost the exact same here. Now, when you look at Vogler's, in example 30, I break it down. I just show it very clearly in one example, and this matches Vogler's pattern that he gives in his example 31 in his wheel. There is one difference, and that's that rather than the pure descent, Beethoven adds the new scale degree 5 of the new key after the descent, but it's extremely similar to Vogler's circle. So the argument, I think, is that Beethoven likely encountered this circle and then wrote a piece inspired by it. That's how I'm seeing it. Now, the other point of evidence is that these two preludes treat the seam between C sharp and D flat differently. And in Vogler's work, we find different modulation patterns between these keys. And so another thing about Vogler's work that's really interesting is that he includes a ridiculous number of modulations from C major to every other key, and from E major to every other key, G sharp to every other key. And so it's comprehensive. So if someone wanted to learn modulation for church, let's say, which Beethoven worked in a church, which he would have had to know how to modulate smoothly to connect different parts of the liturgy and so forth. This Vogler book would have been a great source for that. And of course, Vogler was a church musician as well, who studied with other church musicians like Padre Martini and Francesco Bellotti.
Yeah, he was known. He did organ improvisations around Europe, so he was well known, quite a well-known figure then. Okay, so yeah, that's really so we connected. So we have the modulations. What about solfeggio? You even tie that in to his training. Now, when we think of solfeggio now in the current the fad, the excitement now is of course the hexachordal thing. But I wonder, is there some echo of that in Beethoven's learning?
Yeah, absolutely. So in example 46, we find hexachordal solemnization.
Really?
Wow. So and you mutate on the sol. So you have these two hexachords right there.
Same book.
This is the Vogler work. Yep. Yeah. And so he probably would have learned it like this. Now, Vogler's work is eminently practical. So if we go to example 47, we have a singing exercise, and you see we'll let it load here. These are all high resolution. And so we have ud, re, mi, fa, sol, and so forth. And so you would sit at the keyboard, play these, and sing this erste Singleiter hinauf. And so you would be working on your solfege with working on your keyboard. And if we go to subsequent examples, he introduces more complex singing examples. So maybe example 51 is a good one to go to.
Wow.
Now this is we don't have the solfege anymore. We're at a little later stage.
Yeah.
But we're leaping triadically. So we're singing all of these things. Now we have an actual, and he shows you here too. We have the keyboard practice, and then underneath that he even has the Hauptklang. So he couples the theory, the fundamental bass theory, with the solfeggio, with keyboard practice. And then if you analyze this excerpt, you come to the conclusion that it's actually, and so in measure 52, you see that both of these form small little themes. So we open with a tonic prolongation and then close with an expanded cadential progression. So they're so practical, and they embed so many elements that would have been very useful for Beethoven to learn.
You've got to hand it to this guy. He was a pretty thorough teacher in terms of like his materials. He brought the materials to the classroom.
Oh, absolutely. And another great example, if we could briefly take a look at it, is example 54.
Okay.
So in this example, we have at the very bottom, we have the figured bass, so the basso continuo, and we have a very simple. It opens with a tonic prolongation, dum bum 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 dum bum. So we have a very clear kind of tonic prolongation into a cadence, and then on top we have singing, and you can see the very top here, the Hallelujah, is then he adds a rhythm to it, and the K. And then L, he adds more rhythm, and then we have diminutions, M and N.
Yeah.
And so he's building this structural idea that you can decorate these notes. So diminution is built into a singing exercise over a clear theme pattern. Yeah. Just remarkable.
Yeah, that's really. Now I wondered. So this book, how big is it actually?
It's about 30 pages.
Oh, that's actually not that long. It's action packed then, basically.
Oh yeah, every single page is absolutely crammed. I think I have one full example. Actually, I have two pages from the entire book. Let me see if I can pull. Actually, I have the page with the rule of the octave on it. That's pretty fun. Let me see if I can pull that up here.
Let's see if I can. Example 13. No, that's Kirnberger. Let's see. Vogler's rule of the octave. Is that 58?
Yeah, that's 58, but I have the entire page
Okay, maybe
that
is
it's
it this one?
on.
I think this is it. 57?
What example?
No, at the bottom here. Is this the rule of the
Yeah,
octave?
that's it. That's it. What
Okay.
example is that?
I think this is 57. I see the
Oh yeah, it is. Yeah, exactly.
the
That's it. Yeah,
solfeggio
sorry,
here.
I couldn't. Yeah, yeah. So here's a full page. So if we just look at this page briefly here, we have the zweite Singleiter. So we have the solfeggio on the top here.
Yeah.
And notice we also have the hexachordal mutation on sol. So sol becomes ut. We have a keyboard pattern, and then if you go down further, figure 3 shows the hexachordal mutation quite clearly. Then he has little diminution patterns, cadential embellishments, then the rule of the octave in figure 9. And you'll notice in the figure 9 that he shows you the rule of the octave, and then in small notes labeled Hauptklang, that's the fundamental bass.
Right.
And he shows you that if you look at the fundamental bass, well, then the figured bass above the fundamental bass is a 7, right? And so that's what those little numbers underneath there mean. And then right below that is the alternate manner of harmonizing the scale. So the 5/6 chain up and the 7/6 down. And this is the exact similar presentation that we find in Parlamento sources. So you get the rule of the octave, and then you get the 7/6 suspension chain downwards and the 5/6 up. And this 5/6 up and 7/6 down can be embellished with chromatic harmonies, which is what Beethoven does in his prelude, his first prelude for organ or piano, the strange one that modulates through all the keys. So, yeah, I mean, it's just like the amount of information on just this page alone is enormous.
So yeah, it's definitely the rule of that. You have the descending, you have the augmented 6 there on the scale degree. So yeah, it's pretty much clear that he definitely, if he did read this book, indeed, he would have been definitely exposed to this. And I am just gobsmacked by the ut re mi fa sol la, right in that. In that. And what year was this book?
1776.
Okay, so that's pretty fair along in the 18th century then.
Yep. And he basically he wrote this book just after he got back from Italy. So Vogler studied in Italy with Padre Martini, who of course has a connection with Leopold Mozart, and then Volotti.
Volotti, I think he really liked Volotti, right? Because he was kind of progressive compared to Martini.
Yes. I think from what I read, the Martini apparently was really into the Fuchsian approach. The thing is that when we hear these accounts of like, oh, I wasn't into this guy, or like, I didn't, I've had teachers in my life where I thought, this is not my favorite teacher, but I think I learned a lot from them, even if I didn't really like them. and historically, when Mozart's kind of denigrating Vogler, like Vogler was amazing. And he clearly was respected. He got the Kapellmeister position, and Mozart didn't. And now we listen to Mozart. We don't know Vogler very well, but I think we have to take all of these things with a grain of salt.
Yeah. No, definitely. I mean, I was reading a lot of Tchaikovsky's letters. He was bashing people left and right, but these are great composers and stuff. I know for me, Chopin and Schumann. This Chopin trashing Schumann. Schumann is great. So
it's a lot of marketing, right? I mean, I think as a musician, ultimately you have to market yourself, and there's been different marketing approaches historically. And these tie into the genius narrative and so forth. And I guess part of my work has been to try to understand, to strip the genius away and look at these people as regular mortal humans that had to learn and work and to figure all this stuff out.
Right. Fantastic. Okay, so is there anything we can? I feel like we really just skimmed over Kirnberger. Like we didn't really get much in. Should we talk a little bit more about Kirnberger? We just spent all that time on Vogler.
Yeah. So let's go back to Kirnberger here for a minute. And maybe we could dive back into the idea of prolongation.
Okay.
And so maybe what we could do is we could start with example 12. Now, example 12 is quite interesting because Vogler has a scale fragment. So we have three staves. The very top is the harmonization. The bass, the first bass stave is the basso continuo, and then below that we have FB for fundamental bass, and it's C major. Now, I've added the circled Arabic numbers, which is common in Parlamento scholarship now, and I've added the T for tonic. But even though I've added these things, it's clear that Vogler, he didn't notate them, but he understood them as such. And so I'm just adding things that are implicit in his treatise, and I'm making them explicit in the examples. Now, the bass ascends from 1 through 5, and on each arrow, he has a passing tone in the bass that he then harmonizes. And so he has a pedal on the top, and he has the ascending bass, and then plus harmonizations of all of the bass notes. And he says here that the fundamental bass doesn't change. It's just tonic. So this is a great example here of a tonic prolongation that goes all the way from 1 through 5 back to 3. And all of the intermediary harmonies are durchgehende Akkorde, so passing chords. Yeah. So this gives you the concept that we're just prolonging the tonic over a longer period of time. Yeah. Okay, so, and then he shows you, what I did is I said, okay, well, what if we remove the top voice? And if you go to example 13, so here I've just eliminated the annotational fundamental bass layer, and I've showed the top layer, and I changed a couple notes from the pedal. So the ones that are in parentheses that just neighbor and harmonize that note without keeping the pedal. And actually what you have here is you have a segment of the rule of the octave.
Yes.
And but with what they would call a feigned cadence, or what we would today understand as an abandoned cadence. And so this is a classic Parlamento thing. And the rule of the octave, as Giorgio Sanguinetti shows, is in many sense it's an outgrowth of a simple cadence. Yeah. So and then a full harmonization. So yeah. Now Kirnberger extends this. So not only can we prolong the tonic, we can prolong the dominant. And example 14 shows a very similar idea. Again, he's not using the word prolongation, but the idea is the same. And we have here the fundamental bass shows the note G. So this is, and he tells us this is a dominant harmony. And then at the very end, it resolves to the tonic. And so the intermediary chord built above 6, which I figured here, is passing. And the dominant function maintains between the scale degree 5 and scale degree 7. These still maintain the dominant function as indicated by the fundamental bass. So
these I just wanted to I'm just, it's interesting when I looked at Albrechtsberger's thorough bass, if I didn't have this extra layer of fundamental bass analysis, it almost looks like it could be Italian. I mean, if it's just sure. they've added something, an extra layer of analysis to it. But what do you think about all this? Like, for instance, is there, like, with the, like, for instance, that augmented 6 on the descending 6th scale degree and that sort of thing, is that viewed as a different mutation from a different key, or are we starting to see that that's just, it's common practice and we just do that on that scale degree and it's fine? Or what sort of analysis do you have on situations like that where you, I guess in the Parlamento, you would have seen it more as some kind of like a pull from another key and that sort of thing. How does that square with this idea of, this, now we're really looking at tonics and dominants and prolongations, and this is really just extra spice in the prolongation?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't know the answer to that exactly. And I think it would depend on the musical context, I suppose, and whether we see it as part of a prolongation or Vogler, we can go back to him, he introduces the augmented chords, the French 4/3, the Italian, and he calls them cadences. And his cadence theory, we can look at it, it's quite different than what we understand as cadences today. But in Beethoven's works, for example, we often see an augmented chord right before a 5 chord. And the augmented chord often accentuates the 5, which marks a half cadence. And maybe there's a study on it that I don't know. I worked on analyzing all of Beethoven's sonata with Bill Kaplan, because he's doing a big Beethoven
all of them
project. Yeah.
Wow. Is that available?
So they're working on it right now. So I did a kind of a first pass through, if you will. And the plan, as I understand it, is to have an analysis of all of those sonatas available online. And that's one of Bill's work. So he has several people working with him on this. And
gotta bring him back.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was at the very beginning of that project, and I was tasked with kind of doing an initial pass through the sonatas. And then the goal was to discuss these sonatas, and if there's different interpretations for things, which there often are, because Beethoven sometimes plays with functional ambiguity, then those are interesting moments. But anyway, one thing I noticed is that the half cadence, when he marks the half cadence with the dominant harmony, he often precedes that with an augmented sixth, or with sharp 4 going up. And so there's kind of, I think if he's thinking like Vogler, which is I don't know, but if he is, then he's understanding this as a cadence in a similar way to how Vogler introduces the concept of cadence.
Okay. Shall we? Okay. We go back to Kirnberger now.
Yeah.
So.
Okay. Yeah. So we went through prolongation.
Dominant. We did tonic prolongation. We did dominant prolongation. What's next?
Yeah. So one point I make, like if we look at example 16. Example 16, I show a small excerpt from Beethoven's Opus 7 piano sonata in E flat major. And my point here is not to say that Beethoven opened his Kirnberger when he wrote this. That's not at all. He's not, I don't think he's doing that at this point. But my point is that we analyze this passage right here. We would say that the first part is a tonic prolongation and the second part is a dominant prolongation. And I think Beethoven would have understood that in exactly the way that we describe it. And I think that's my point. My point is that Beethoven is consciously aware of these things in much the same way that we are analyzing them. And so I'm personally very interested in analytical music theoretical approaches that align well with how I think Beethoven thought. So that's my interest. And here you'll notice I have a slightly different notation. I have a TP, which is for passing, and then T6, meaning that it's a 1/6 chord. Now the 1/6 chord, even though it's still a tonic, it functions slightly different than the root position tonic. And Bill in class, he likes to do this thing where the root position tonic, you stand on 2 legs, and the 1/6 or the first inversion, you stand on 1 leg. And it's a little wobbly, and you can fall over in towards the dominant and go towards the cadence, or you can fall back to the root position tonic.
It's a little lighter, isn't it? It's a little bit lighter than the root position tonic.
And this is speaking to the idea that while we still have this concept of prolongation and kind of harmonic function, we still have a distinction between the chord built on scale degree 3 with a 6/3. So there's still this CPE Bach partimento horizontal thinking, kind of contrapuntal complexes. It's not just the harmonic functions theory, right? It's coupled here. It's all tied together in a way that's really hard to tease out. And so theoretically, we might tease it out and pull it apart and say, no, throw away the Roman numerals, throw away the functions theory. I think we have to be careful, especially with Beethoven, not to throw out the baby with the bathwater.
Yeah, because he was so thrilled when who is Mendelssohn's friend, the Adolf Bernhard Marx gave a review, an analysis, a music theory analysis, and he said this guy's got it right. So and Marx is, of course, wants to end thorough bass completely. So it's a lot of different things happening all at the same time. And when he asked to teach Czerny, right, he says bring CPE Bach, and CPE Bach is totally hostile to Rameau. So it's all over the place. So people like you have to help us kind of piece it all together and figure it out, because it's a mess.
It is absolutely a mess. And again, it's a lot about marketing and fortifying your position as a theorist or as a, someone who's selling something. Schenker had to say, this is the authoritative theory on the Eroica analyzed and for the first time, like this type of language.
Did he say that?
Yeah, he has an analysis of the Eroica. It's something like that. I'm paraphrasing, but it's way over the top.
Or text analysis.
Yeah. This is the authoritative statement on the Eroica.
Right.
But we all do that to some extent. I mean, I think my interpretation of the Eroica is like, God, what a fun piece. We're having a conversation about that. And so as scholars, we have to say, this is what I believe in, and that might intersect in some ways with others, or it might oppose, and we stake our position on it. But maybe we were
Well, Professor Posen, okay, so this is a pretty well-documented composer, Beethoven. Are you telling Bach? I can understand. You barely wrote anything about music, just a few things, scraps here and there. But Beethoven, you're telling me in letters and all sorts of that. Has he ever really explained like his theoretical process, or that's really still we have to fight over it?
Yeah, we have one excellent, fantastic letter. This is something that unfortunately got cut from my dissertation. And I had to get cut from this article because MTO has a word limit now, which is a bummer. But yeah, there's, God, it's such a fantastic letter. So Beethoven receives a note from a string quartet, and they're asking him about a 30-second note. And I can't remember which piece it is. I can pull up the paper, but they're asking Beethoven about a 30-second note in one of his pieces, and they say, should it be this note or this note? Beethoven writes a 3-page response back and says, no, it must be this note. And he gives an explanation in thorough bass. He says, this is what it is in thorough bass. And he also tells us about the fundamental bass. And so he was willing to explain a 30-second note in his piece in great detail. So if pressed, he could tell you why it was there. Of course, I think when he's composing, it's we're not thinking about all these things. Just like when I type, if I type a sentence, I'm not thinking, I better press each key. It just happens, right? But if someone asks me, you put a T at the end of the word cat there, like, did you mean that? Like, yes, and I can tell you why, right?
This is the second time you've given me another crazy anecdote that I've never. That's amazing.
Yeah.
Wow, that should be well known. Could you share that anecdote, the source for that anecdote? People would be so fascinated by that.
Let me pull up I was thinking about writing a book on Beethoven, but we'll see.
And by the way, that guest book with that organ competition do we have any sort of response or person who was there as a viewer of that, or is it just a note in the guest book?
Yeah, Julia Range, she's a Beethoven scholar at the Beethoven House. She verified that for me. She's the one who notified me of this source. And so she looked into the correspondence between, basically whether Vogler was in Bonn or not. And the evidence now I think is quite conclusive that he did visit Bonn. It's not clear how many times he visited Bonn. I think he might have been in Bonn 2 to potentially 3 times. So the source is by Jonas, so Oswald Jonas, and it's from 1952 in the Musical Quarterly, and it's called A Lesson with Beethoven by Correspondence. And it's just fantastic. And so Beethoven writes the letter on Opus 127, so the string quartet, and it's a 30-second note. It's in the second variation, measure 10. And Beethoven goes in great detail, explaining it first in the thorough bass. So he says this is a 6/4, and he writes, everything you need to know about this 30-second note in this letter. Just fantastic.
What's I know you play jazz because I've seen in your CV, and I've seen some things. So
not very well. But
no, but that world. So what's interesting is I've interviewed so many jazz musicians and I've read so many jazz biographies, and to get a straight answer sometimes is very difficult, depending on who you ask in the jazz world. It's like, man, you just
Mm.
gotta feel it. You know, sometimes you get
Yeah.
no help whatsoever if you have a simple question about something theoretical. What are you playing? Why are you thinking? But like,
Mhm.
of course, to be fair, there are of course great jazz pedagogues as well. So,
Mhm.
but for classical music, I just like this idea that you can explain every single note on the page perfectly, and it's not like a I don't know why I did this. It's just it's a
Yeah.
mystery. It's a mystery. I have no idea. Good luck if you're a student. And that's so annoying. And I you know, for people who've been to master classes, they might have heard this too from a person. It's like, you know what? I don't know what I was feeling that day, but it's just this is what you get, and good luck figuring out what it was. But it is reassuring that if you do want to understand music in many situations, and even you know classical music can be considered complex and complicated,
Mhm.
you can explain it. And I think you know the work of Partimento, the work of General Bass, you know, these new analytical tools that are coming out in the last 20 years that are really helping this. Because you know I've asked so many
Absolutely.
performers who play Beethoven and they have no idea what's going on. It's often,
Mhm.
you know, nowadays we're shifting from pure just performance and interpretation to now they actually, the performer knows what's going on. They can actually perform.
Yeah.
My goodness, they can improvise, you know,
Yeah,
based
it's
on the
changing.
score. It's crazy.
Yeah.
You might go to something and you might go to a piece and they might just perform and improvise based on that because they have the technical, they have the theoretical tools and the training to be able to do something. So we're seeing a really incredible push forward in creativity and the musicians being able to do things that are maybe unheard of 30, 40 years ago. Now people say, I've been doing figure bass since the 60s. Okay, great. All right, great.
Yeah.
You're the champion. Okay, you're the winner. But I'm just saying in the mainstream now we're starting to see it's starting to be a bit more accessible.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, yeah, no, you raise a great point. And there are musicians out there. So I, in addition to my Beethoven work, I work in the electronic dance music world. So I produce electronic dance music. I'm very interested in Joel Zimmerman and Dead Mouse, and in that world, you don't have the same level of theoretical understanding, and a lot of electronic music producers have not studied theory, don't
Mm,
know really what a scale is that well, but you know they work with their DAW and they sound engineer, and so but they could tell you the specifics of how they created that sound. So
mm,
it's and maybe they don't know why the chords work or so forth, but they can tell you other specific things. And so there is some tension between a feeling in music and just kind of doing it and
mm,
understanding it. And I think uh, I see music theory as symbiotically related to music practice, and so that theory does not always follow practice, and then sometimes theory precedes practice. Sometimes theory is a reflection after a
mm,
practice. So I think it's not one or the other. I think you and kind of there are people who like to say like, oh, like don't think about theory when you do that. And when I make my electronic pieces, I don't initially think like theoretically what chords I
mm,
want to use. So I write some things, but then I reflect on the chords that I have
mm,
written, decide what I like, and then put more of those. And so it's an interaction with theory. And I think Beethoven
mm.
did the same too. And that's one of the arguments I make in my dissertation, that he has a compositional problem that he then reflects upon. And it's about how do I solve this? And that's theorizing fundamentally.
Mm. So, do we have any concluding thoughts now from your article? And I think it's really a very interesting article. I'm glad when people
Thank
add
you.
more light onto mysteries. I mean, so I mean mysteries. So, if we can get any more information, thank you for doing that. Do you have so concluding thoughts and what your future research plans are?
Sure. So I think this is just the tip of the iceberg. At this article, I looked at two treatises. So what I did is I went to Nottebohm's source, and Nottebohm suggests that Beethoven, he has a pretty comprehensive article on Beethoven's Bonn studies. Not comprehensive, but speculative, and kind of like
Mm,
these are the big treatises at that time when Beethoven was a kid in Bonn. And these are the treatises that he likely had some interaction with. And then I went and looked at those treatises, knowing what I know about the thorough bass parlamento tradition and kind of how Mozart was educated and, you know, all of these other composers. And I thought, okay, which of these treatises would have been highly relevant to Beethoven and appropriate for what he was doing at the time? And I ended up picking these two treatises, also because there was some, I think, good evidence linking them to Beethoven. But there's other works in there, like some Petrie's treatise. There's a lot of treatises that don't have the limelight anymore, but were quite significant in their time and probably have lots of interesting nuggets and will show the connection and the interconnection between different nations in Italy and Germany and France and so forth. And so I think they're very connected. So I'm hoping that we can translate, well, maybe one day I'll translate that Nottebohm piece. So there needs to be some translation work around this. There needs to be investigation of Beethoven's library, which is happening at the Beethoven House, and also of these other treatises. And then I think ideally we could do more intense analyses of his early works. So his Elector sonatas, I just skimmed the surface. I mean, I analyzed the main theme in these, but there's, you know, they're complete works. And also his early piano concerto and some other works that we could look at just to see, what did he know as a child, effectively? Like, what was he using and where did this come from? And so I think there's still a lot of work to do in this area. And I'm hoping that I've kind of taken a step out on the edge. And I think it is speculative. I acknowledge that 100%. But I'm hoping that some other scholars will pursue this sort of speculative inquiry. As far as my subsequent scholarship, I have a stack of work that I'd like to revisit in relation to Beethoven. One is on the relationship between how, like, whether formal functions, Bill Kaplan's idea of formal functions, whether that was something that was in Beethoven's mind. And there might be some people who say, you can never know what's in Beethoven's mind. And I've abandoned that thought because I figure I believe in composer intentionality, so meaning that I can understand the intentions of a composer. I might be wrong. I'm willing to acknowledge that, but I'm willing to try. And if someone else is willing to try and they can convince me that they get closer to that intention, I'll adopt their view 100%. And so I think, so that's been an interest. And that's something I explored in the sketches, is looking at, and I found actually that Beethoven would write, let's say, presentation kind of, and then he would vary the continuation. So he knew he needed a continuation. He didn't think of it as a continuation, that word. He needed some medial thing. And he tried different versions of it. So it does seem that even though Bill derived his theory after the fact, he deduced it by analyzing many pieces, it does seem that it kind of corresponds well with how Beethoven himself thought. So I'm giving a presentation in Graz, Austria in March on that concept that just kind of shows how Beethoven was comparing successive sketches to show the validity of the separation between a formal function and the content that helps create that function. So that's another work I'm doing. So there's some Beethoven sketch scholarship work and kind of Beethoven pedagogy that I'm very interested in. And then lately I'm working on writing a theory of form as it relates to harmony for the music of deadmau5, EDM producer.
Two quick things. Your dissertation, is it available for people to read?
It is, yes. It's freely available. I have it on my website, which I will update soon. It's also it's public on my Facebook, Tom Posen. And yeah, so there's my website. I'll put a link to the dissertation there more prominently. And then you can find it at McGill and ProQuest. So it's freely available. I'm happy to talk about that with anybody. I've had some nice people reach out as a consequence of my YouTube video. I have a YouTube video that shows I play some of the sketches, and that's kind of fun. And I should
come back again, okay? Maybe we'll tackle your dissertation next.
Yeah,
that sounds like fun.
It's a lot of fun. It's a really fun work, and with that work, I kind of imagine myself as Beethoven's neighbor, listening to him composing the Eroica, out the window or something, and then he gave me his shorthand, like, okay, go recreate it. And so I had a blast with that, and then. Final thing, I have another article coming out in Music Theory and Analysis. It's called The Interaction of Mode and Psalmody in Heinrich Glerien's Circle, or in Glerien's Circle, I don't have the word Heinrich. And this kind of looks at a very important part on the path from mode to major and minor keys that we may want to talk to. I know you had Michael Dodds on, or Will.
Yeah. Will. It got a bit delayed, but he's
so,
coming on.
Yeah. So this work intersects with his new book, in some interesting ways. And so I'm very interested in the history of theory, compositional process, and how composers create the works that they do.
Yeah. It's interesting, right? When we were kids, we were like, I want to learn the instrument. Who knew we had to learn the entire history of music, right?
Yeah. I really do think that a lot of theorists, like, I haven't met a theorist that enters college and thinks, I'm going to be a music theorist. Like, I don't think that exists. And rather, at least what happened to me, maybe it does, I don't know, for people who are aware of that. But I discovered music theory when I had to take music theory as a pianist. And I remember learning species counterpoint. And I thought, this unlocks the keys to composition. Oh my God. And then I went to go compose and I thought, oh, I need to study more. and you realize, like, oh wow, this is a black hole, right? It just goes on and on. But theory is so fun. And so I see it as interrelated with composition and performance and practice. And so to me, it's all bundled up. But I also do like theory for theory's sake. It's pretty fun.
Yeah. Maybe one final thing. It just came to mind, and you mentioned formal functions. I enjoy schema theory, and I know, but with regard to form, right? So what do you make of these? I think I asked Professor Yerdigan, and I don't think he thinks too much in the same way of form as perhaps Professor Kaplan. Like, he has schemas and then he leaves it at that. I think really pretty much that. But you know everything now. You know the partimento, you know schema. You've looked at everything, and you've worked with Professor Kaplan. And so how do you look at form? Is it are there different schools of thought with regard to form, and how does a student perhaps take the best of both worlds, maybe choose a school of thought? I mean, what's your opinion there?
Well, I'll acknowledge my bias right off the bat. I mean, I did study with Bill, and so I'm thoroughly seeped in the tradition of formal function. But I believe strongly in the idea of formal function. And so one of the examples I give to my students in my classes, I tell them, I draw a sundial on the board, and then I ask them, what's this piece right here? And I point to what's called a gnomum. And I say, what is this? And the answer is, what I would say is, like, the most sensical answer is that, the gnomum is the object that projects a shadow onto the sundial so we can tell the time, right? So we describe the gnomum in terms of its function. And when we're analyzing music and we say, well, what is its function? I read somewhere they said visual art is the decoration of visual space, and music is the decoration of time. And so if we're decorating time, it's about how do we decorate time. And in time, we have a sense that there's a beginning, a middle, and an end, and then there's parts between those. And maybe there's something before the beginning, something after the end. And so that concept, while very simple initially, is extremely powerful, because it says that we can look at this and this piece will intrinsically tell us what function it's serving. And of course, it's related to the surrounding nature as well. But I think Bill's work is very, very powerful, and he wouldn't say that it necessarily derives from Beethoven's thinking, but I would, and that's something that obviously I would need to substantiate and more scholarship, but we'll see if I get there. But I think his 2013 book, Analyzing Classical Music: An Approach for the Classroom, is a fantastic book. It's very well written, very accessible. So I think someone interested in form should go there. There's another whole topic on the relationship between schemata, and form. There's some overlap, like a quiescenza, for example, is an opening gesture, and it can also serve as a closing gesture. So tonic prolongations are typically opening and closing. And so there does seem to be some overlap. Bill also has an article on this, on the relationship between the two. It's not fully worked out yet. But I will maybe just mention one quote again by Felix Diergarten. And he talks about he writes in his editorial, and I can mention the issue of the editorial, but he says, to re-theorize Partimenti in 18th century music means to move beyond a pioneer phase characterized by scholars discovering more and more schemata on which they plant their flags by giving them idiosyncratic and personal names. It means to proceed from a phase of reification of single schemata, something certainly necessary, especially for pedagogy, to a phase in which the entirety of tonal schemata can be seen against a rich 18th century theoretical background. I tend to agree with him here. And I think if music theory is a meta-language, then our meta-language needs to be accessible, precise, and concise, meaning that if we call something, I won't use any of the
Posen.
Some of these, yeah, like what is a Posen, right? Like it doesn't tell us what it is. And this is the problem I have with some other theories of form, like a type 2 sonata. What's a type 2 sonata? Like it doesn't tell us anything. I have to go reference type 2 in some book. Whereas if you told me this is a sonata without a development, oh, okay, it has an exposition or recapitulation, like, okay, and it's lacking in development, like what, okay, whatever. You know, if the language is precise and it tells me what the thing is doing, so this is a presentation, this is a continuation, this is ending, I think it's a very effective meta language versus a meta language that obscures and kind of hides the idea within, you have to go look it up in this book if you want to know what a type 1 sonata is. I don't ascribe to that idea.
Okay. See, this is me tearing my draft for my Hogan schema, so I'll just have to destroy it now.
No, but you know what?
The Hogan.
Okay, I will come back on this one concept because I'm
kidding. I'm just kidding.
Yeah, no, of course. But sometimes having names for things is incredibly useful. And so when I teach people some improvisation techniques, I say, this is a quiescenza, right? Well, what is a quiescenza? A student asked me that yesterday. What's a quiescenza? Well, this is what it is musically, but why is it called a quiescenza? I don't really, it's like, but this is what everybody calls it. So we just use that, know.
Well, the great Professor Thomas W. Posen, thank you so much for sharing that great article. And you owe me another visit with your dissertation. Okay. I think,
I would love to. It's been great talking with you. And I'm very honored. I've learned a lot from listening to this podcast with the great people you've hosted, and you answer wonderful questions. So thank you so much for including me in this.
Pleasure's all mine, and thank you for coming on the show. And I hope we come on again. I need to find all the people who are fans of Beethoven. Like, there's quite a number, I think, who are real like Beethoven experts, and have a Beethoven off. Like a panel of just like. I'm sure there's a lot of common ground, but there might be also disagreements. It could be very interesting too, as well as certain ways to look at things. But I think Beethoven's a genius, and of course one of the great figures in classical music, and certainly deserves lots of attention because you can learn so much from him. And I'm amazed that we're still learning new things. One of the most looked at composers is like Mozart. Every scrap of paper of Mozart has touched has been analyzed. But we're still finding new things, and we're still also looking at it in a way that's really, really, I think, radically different. Because now we're getting people who can compose and improvise and take a score and look at it. And that's what you were saying about the theory. I think it has to be practical, right? It has to have a point to it that you can use it. And not be, not. Do you think that's the theory? Is there certain kinds of theories you don't think are, well, rather than naming a specific theory, can you say that what about theory can be dangerous?
Yeah, that's a loaded question. I don't think there's anything that can be dangerous about theory. The only thing that I'm concerned about is sort of maybe what I would call, I don't know if it's related to fraud or not, but like passing a theory off as, I'm thinking maybe of, so I did an analysis of Bernstein's Cool Fugue from West Side Story. And turns out you can model the fugue with uniform triadic transformations using Hooke's theory, and you can model it mathematically. And it works surprisingly well. I think it's just about, if I were to tell someone like, this is how Bernstein composed this piece, I think that's not accurate. And so the mathematical model, I'm not so sure that it it also uses Klumpenhauer networks, which are, Michael Buckler has critiqued these and for good reason. And so it uses frameworks and theories and approaches that maybe don't reflect how the music was generated or was thought about, or even how we should think about it when we perform it. But I still think it's interesting. So when we model something mathematically, it's still very interesting. So I don't think it's dangerous. I just think we need to be clear about why we're doing the things that we're doing. And so if we're doing theory for theory's sake, that's fine. Like, that theory's fun. And to think about these things in abstract ways is fantastic. But if we're tasked with teaching today's musicians, and so we have to keep that in our mind too, that we're part of a larger system in a music school, and in my case at a liberal arts school. And so for it differs at the school, right? My students, I think it's important for them to learn the history and to be connected to the ideas and where they came out of and so forth. Whereas at a conservatory, maybe that's important to an extent, but maybe we need to focus on the practical elements so that you can perform in the symphony next weekend, right? So it's really about just being honest about why we're doing the things we're doing and to what effect that they have.
AI to analyze Beethoven corpus. Like, how will that affect Beethoven's studies? I mean, that would be useful, right? I mean, to see how many times he does a certain movement or he does a certain chord change. So what do you think about that? Using AI to analyze Beethoven, at least the corpus studies.
Yeah, well, I'm excited about AI. I mean, I think ultimately AI is a tool that we will interact with, and it's about how well you can interact with that tool and how well you understand more or less what that tool will help you do. So like the other day, I used an AI tool to generate a logo. And it was pretty cool because it said, do you want to do what kind of colors? And then it came up with a logo, and then it gave me 20 options. And I thought, oh, actually, I'm going to go towards this one. And then, so I guided the AI towards a solution. Now, it depends on how good your questions are fundamentally. So in sketch studies, for example, I often make the simple observation that when you read a Beethoven sketch and you say, were those parallel ninths that he was writing or parallel octaves? Like, was it just a parallel octave texture or was it ninths? Well, it's probably parallel octaves, right? And when we have an analytical question, it's about how good the question is that will give the results. If I say, well, why did you write the note E? And I don't have anything, like, we have to have some sense of connection. So AI will be a tool, I think, and it will depend on how well AI is trained and how good the questions are that we're looking to answer with AI. But I'm excited about it, especially as more and more music has been entered into XML and formats that we can search with a computer. Like, let's say I need an augmented sixth chord to teach, and I can pull up a bunch of examples really quickly. Like, that's awesome. I would love to do that. So I did some work with Mark Gotham, who's I think one of the pioneers of mixing computer science with music theory, and we did some initial phases of coming up with an approach for kind of automatic form function analysis, and we're still a ways away from that. Maybe someday we'll get there. And there's another big grant in Switzerland on this topic, so I'm excited to see what it comes up with, and I hope that people embrace this as just another tool that we use to help us understand things.
Great. Well, Professor Posen, thank you for being on the show, and I will talk to you soon.
Great. I look forward to it.
Bye.